Hi there, my name is Robin Collins, and in this video I'm going to give a brief overview of the topic of history of hairdressing. You'll find a number of resources and links at Indie Online in the topic block Demonstrate Knowledge of History of Hairdressing. I think this particular topic is really important to all stylists because it's really important the influence that history has on our current hairdressing. And as a stylist, if you know where we've been, it's a lot easier to know why we are, or how we've got to where we are, or where we might go in the future. So history has a really big impact on all areas of our careers and our services as a stylist. I think there's a lot of interesting facts that we find in history when we're researching, and the advancements that we have made from bygone eras, technological advancements. If you look back to some of the intricate styles from many centuries ago, how they achieved those without the technology that we have, or electricity for a start, that we have today. So this particular unit I'm sure you'll find really interesting, and I'm hoping that this overview gives you some idea as to what's required of you. So the assessment for the history of hair is an assignment. You need to demonstrate knowledge of 2 eras from a list in hairdressing, and you will find imagery of the hairstyles worn in those eras. You need to describe the construction, so how they styled the hair, what they used to style the hair. You need to describe the maintenance of hair in that era. The second part of the assignment, you are required to demonstrate knowledge of cultural influences from history. So you need to look at the Maori hair designs and how the construction and maintenance of that came about back in those generations, any ornamentation that was worn, and you need to talk about what you may see in today's world of hairdressing as an influence that has come from that culture. In addition to that, you need to choose 2 other cultures from a list that's in your assignment and talk about the same thing. So how do they wear their hair in that culture? What influences do we see in today's world of hairdressing from those cultures? I think it's important for this video for me just to give you a brief overview of the benefits of research and going through those links that are on Indie Online, and reading and finding out information about different things, even if you just start doing something really briefly before you decide what eras you want to cover, because there is such a wide range of eras that are available for us. It's really interesting and I think exciting for us to have a look at a wide variety before you make that decision to just 2. So don't just rush in and say, right, I'm going to do the first 2 on the list and I'm only going to find out information about those generations. Take the time to look at the different eras and the different centuries of hairdressing, and how hairdressing has evolved, and how technology has evolved, and how the different styling practices have evolved before you actually go on with your assignment. I think it's really valuable to know how back in past generations and eras, hair has gone, it sort of was very simple back in the sort of the medieval days, in some cases, to very intricate. So you sort of had social classes and perhaps those times that were poles apart, and you might look at the 18th century and the structures of hair design then. They were just so out there, and the ornamentation was just so incredible. I mean, you just can't even imagine wearing your hair in that fashion in today's world. And you will see that as you visit the sites and the links. I think it's really important that you pay attention to the construction and how they achieved that. Some of those really high and huge hairstyles that they had in the 18th century, for example. The hair was dressed over wire frames that were placed on top of the head, and then the hair was sort of built on top of it. And hopefully you'll have the opportunity to do some historical hairstyling in your training provider, to actually see how difficult it was to get the hair into those designs. But not only did they use frames, they used what they call metal fillets that were curved or shaped so they could sit on the head, and they wrapped the hair around them, and people wore those until the next time they had their hair styled or dressed. When they were styling hair, they used irons to curl hair, or they used clay and shapes made from animal bones. I don't mean, you know, literally an animal bone, but they used bone shapes to wrap hair around, which was quite a primitive sort of way of setting hair. When they permed hair, they, you know, back in the early eras and early centuries, they used clay to bake the hair into these curls and left them on for huge quantities of time so that the curls stayed in the hair for months. They didn't shampoo it out. One of the primitive forms of perming, they used cow urine as a solution, because the ammonia in the solution would separate the hair. And it sounds revolting, but it's just, if you look on the topics and do your research, you will see that back in those primitive times, that's how they actually created curls. You've often, many of us have heard about how in the earlier 20th century where they wrapped their hair in rags. I mean, that wasn't just then, they did that in earlier eras as well, where they wrapped the hair around in rags and tied them together, and they were quite comfortable to sleep in by comparison to sleeping in fillets or nets or meshes or anything like that. So there are actually videos on your Indie Online topic block on how to tie hair in rags, and although it's a modern video, it is how they did that back in past generations and past eras. I think it's really important too to think about how they maintained their hair back in those generations. If you think there was no electricity, and you certainly didn't have a shower with a running hot and cold tap, and you certainly didn't have the luxury of the shampoos and the products that we have now. So just the logistics of bathing meant that maintenance and hygiene was definitely not as the standard is today, with some of us who shower maybe twice a day or 2 or 3 times a day, depending on whether you train or play sport or what you do. In past generations in history, hygiene was not as easy to maintain in terms of bathing daily, and in terms of washing their hair or shampooing their hair and washing their bodies and clothes and things like that. They didn't have what we have today, so it was certainly a lot more difficult. As you go through your research for your assignment, you'll actually learn a lot about this, and I think it's really valuable for you to reflect on. Imagine putting yourself there now. You know, certainly when they shampooed their hair, because they didn't have the products, as I said, they used soap, or they just used different mixations of plant material to cleanse their hair, or to colour their hair, or products. Some of the research that I was looking at recently, they used animal fat combined, if you can imagine, with candle wax and oil to create hair products that held hair in place. I mean, I just can't even imagine how that would be, and I think that again illustrates why it's really important as you do your research to imagine if that's what you had to do today to create a style for your clients. In terms of hygiene as well, what they did a lot of the time was they used powders and dustings and perfumes to mask the odour and to dry up the oil on the scalp. So where today we have you know, dust it and talcum, texture talcums and texture powders that we use to create strong lift and strong root control, that is actually something that has been influenced from bygone eras, where they used to use talcum powders and dusts to remove oil and make hair stand up. I just wanted to show you a couple of pieces of equipment that I have that are old and were used in the days before technology became as it is. The first thing I'd like to show you was gifted to me by a lovely colleague in our industry. She's had these for years. Now these are an old pair of curling irons that were used back in earlier generations. There's no, as you can see, no electricity, so they were used by heating them on a fire or on coals, and obviously then held in the hair. Now, before they were popped into the hair, they used to test as to how hot they were on either a piece of cloth or a piece of paper, and if it didn't burn the paper or the cloth, then good to go. We were going to use those right on in there with that hair. So you can imagine that there were some times where hair was sensitized or damaged, because it's not a particularly accurate test to test it against fabric or paper. They're made of metal, and the whole iron got hot, so they were obviously held onto with a piece of cloth on the ends. The hair was wrapped around the cylinder side of the tongs, and then when they're clamped shut, the hollow side was clamped on top of the hair. Now, because it was hot, just like a curling iron today, the hair became curly, but as you can see by the size of this cylinder here, it was significantly curly, and certainly a lot smaller than the irons we see today. Another item that I have is a pair of handheld clippers. Now, these obviously, again, they're not particularly old, and they're really quite easily accessible today in antique stores, but they're interesting for those of you who have never seen them, in terms of they don't have any electricity, and so they were literally used by hand to cut entire heads of hair. The top blade shutters as you close the handle, shutters against the bottom blade, and cuts the hair just as a normal clipper would, but without the electricity and without the adjustments or the guards. Probably something that's significant is the fact that they're actually, the spring loading on them is really quite tight, and as you can see, they stay open without pressure. And so using these for an entire day is just hard to imagine how painful that must have been on a wrist to complete not only one haircut, but 20 haircuts in a day, or however many they did in a day. Certainly, I don't think they'd be whipping them out like they would if they had electric clippers. So it's just a couple of items of historical significance that I am lucky enough to have in my possession, and probably a really good illustration of how technology has changed and how important it is to remember historically where we've come from and just compare it to where we are now. So just to recap what I've been talking about today, I've talked a little bit about history of hairdressing in terms of its influence and where we draw our inspiration for today's trends, and how the cycle of hair goes around and around as it does with fashion. I've talked very, very briefly in terms of some of the construction elements of historical hairdressing, and certainly I've asked you to research and have a look for some of those advancements and influences on today's hairdressing. There's been such a huge shift over the centuries in terms of technological advancement, as I've said earlier, in terms of electricity and tools and equipment that have evolved to create the amazing designs that we see now. But importantly, it's really key that you reflect on what inspires us in today's world, or what we still see in today's world of hairdressing that was used in past eras. So use the links and the research material available to you at Indie Online. This is a truly interesting topic, and it is really, really important for your hairdressing skills to know where we've been, to know where you're going to head to. And I hope you really enjoy it and find it as interesting as I do.